we'll stop the share. So thank you, everybody. Today, we're excited to have Betty Ann Bruno, author of the Munchkin Diary. And this is in the library, so you guys can check it out. So first, so Betty Ann Bruno, some people in our audience may know you if you guys grew up here in the Bay Area. Betty Ann Bruno was a reporter for channel, I don't know what channel it was.
Channel 2.
Channel 2. And so you may remember her from the news. But so Betty, the book is a memoir. So you wrote this memoir, but the catch is that you were a munchkin. And even when I was very excited to hear about a munchkin. And I know that's the first part of the book, is that story. So I guess we'll jump in from there. And if you want to talk a little bit about your munchkin experience in that part of the book.
Well, first I want to thank you very much, Franklin, for inviting me to be part of your author series for the Larkspur Library. It's an honor for me to do that. The curb service at your library, do the librarians for curb service wear skates like they used to with the
There's days where we feel like that we're running back and forth and we should have roller skates on because we're going back and forth so much. On a good day, I can at least walk 3 miles back inside the library. And our library is really small, so we're 3 miles inside and out. So just going back and forth all day.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, and I was at Channel 2, KTVU for 22 years, more than that actually, because I retired and then stayed on and worked for 2 or 3 more years because the news director and I both believed I was not going to be able to live without my work. So I kind of hung around for a couple more years, but I retired a long time ago. So if your viewers here remember me on the air, it means they're old too, because I retired something like 30 years ago. So anyway, welcome. We lived in Hollywood when I was a little girl, and my brother and I took singing and dancing lessons. Everybody in our family was, entertaining or connected with the movie business somehow. We lived next door to a nightclub that my uncle owned and ran. There were 3 shows every night at his nightclub. And he was in movies. He used to be the dark-hatted guy in a lot of Western movies in the 30s. And we lived right across the street. We lived on Western Avenue, right across the street from the 20th Century Fox Studios. So we thought it was perfectly normal to live, to be in the movies. If you lived in Hollywood, that's what you did. So we sang and danced at Bud Murray Studios. Bud Murray was the brother of Arthur Murray, who made an empire out of ballroom dancing. But Bud Murray had the theater dancing and stage dancing in Hollywood. So there were, and on the billboard there, or the notice board, my mother, there were always pasted or tacked notices of auditions. So there was an audition notice one day for little girls not more than 4.5 feet tall who could sing and dance. And my mother took me to the audition and I made the cut. And the work lasted about 3 weeks. We rehearsed for, I believe, about 2 weeks in a practice studio up and down what appeared more like a scaffolding than anything else. But we learned to dance upstairs and downstairs. And then when we were fitted for costumes, I didn't like my costume at all. It was gray felt, and I liked my little hat. It had a little flower pot on top with a bud vase, and that was cute. I liked pointy shoes, that was cute, but I really didn't like my dress gray. I didn't like gray. I like, colors. But when I walked out on that set in my costume and saw the village of the Munchkin, the yellow brick road and the fountains and the little huts around and the big plastic flowers of all colors, it was like I was really transported physically to another world. And because in those days, the Depression, and there was nothing else like that. There was no Disneyland. There were not even Technicolor movies. So everything was kind of gray and black and white, matched my dress. But that was really a wonderful world to be in. And there were all these adults who were not any taller than I was. And that's really what kind of blew me away, because I had always been the shortest one in my class. And all of a sudden I'm with all these men and women, all adults, and I would love to go, I'd sidle up to them and I'd go, you know, here's somebody, oh my God, I'm taller than that person, and he's a grown-up or she's a grown-up. And that was really my little secret thing that I did.
Well, and it's funny because you wrote about that. And I love that it's something for a child, any kid, to meet a little person and then really to be mesmerized by this person who's supposed to be older but is not taller, and it's just the little magical world of just studio life itself. But I just thought that was funny. And then the guy who kept trying to give you the candy bar, that your mom was trying to keep him away from you, which is just there's another funny movie that came out in the 80s called Under the Rainbow, which was supposed to be the life of all the little people that were in the hotel that were filming for the Wizard of Oz. So you get this weird side of what the life would have been like with the little people that were the actors. But I don't know if you ever saw that weird movie, but it's just when you started telling the story about the guy with the candy bar who was sort of leering at you, and that movie popped into my head. It's like, oh no, some of these people were really creepy.
I know. Well, if you saw that movie, which I have not actually, but I certainly have heard about it, and I know all those rumors, but from what and I'll call them midgets. I mean, I know that the term now has become little people, but they call themselves midgets, and I don't think it's a pejorative term, so I will call them midgets. The midgets, I knew later after I went to Oz conventions and so on. So as an adult, I met them in Indiana and also again in Hollywood. They were the nicest people and just salt of the earth kinds of people. And I did not see anything perverse or, you know, I just can't believe the stories about Under the Rainbow. But there was this guy, this midget, who kept asking my mother if he could take me to lunch. And every time he came near us, she would clutch me and hold me protectively to her bosom. And I didn't see anything wrong with, I mean, why lunch? I mean, lunch was just something my mother brought in a brown bag, and we ate lunch in the soundstage next door, you know, across the street, where the Flying Monkeys were practicing their takeoffs and landings. And so I thought lunch was a perfectly innocent thing. Then I realized that he decided that he wasn't going to get anywhere. My mother was never going to let me go to lunch with him. So he asked me what my favorite candy bar was. And I told him, and I thought, well, you know, nothing wrong with that. My favorite candy bar was an O. Henry bar. It was caramel and chocolate and nuts. And the children, and there were a dozen little girls who were, and we were instructed to fill in the background of the village. You can never see any of our faces in any of the movies. So we are the invisible dozen back there just filling in space. We were kept segregated from the midgets, both on and off the set. And so when we arrived at the studio in the morning, we were put in a little office and waited. We had to wait until the midgets arrived and walked down the hall. The front of the office to the hallway was glass. And this midget would come to the doorway and he'd look around, you know, peer into the office where all of us little girls were, and he'd look around till he found me and made eye contact. And then he'd say, reach into his coat pocket and pull out an O. Henry bar, and he'd sort of leer into, you know, that look was not innocent. And I knew I didn't like that look. So then I knew there was something, but I didn't know what. You know, I mean, I was only 7. And
well, no, and I think that any little kid, most little kids, our parents are going to be more aware of what people are doing. And two, is your mom knew that this was a guy, this was an older gentleman who's trying to court her little girl. That would be the big thing. And I guess too, because The Wizard of Oz was not your first film, and you write about some of the other ones that you did. So yeah, which is a really fun thing. But it's just that sort of, I love the story, you wrote this story, but there's so much I want, like so much more about this studio life and living in Hollywood that you probably could write several books about.
Oh my goodness. expand. No, well, the studios were right there, as I said. And the first movie my brother and I were in, I was, I think, 4.5 or 5. And it was Hurricane with Dorothy Lamour and John Hall. And we were just little kids running around in the village. But Dorothy Lamour liked me. And she, during breaks and during her lunch, she used to invite me to, she would read stories to a lot of little kids who wanted to listen, but she always asked me to sit on her lap while she read the stories to the group of children. So when Henry Ford had a special scene that he wanted one little girl to be in that scene, he asked her, you know, talk to her about it. She said, I know just the perfect little girl. And that was me. Well, so he asked me to do it. And I was kind of horrible in it. I mean, I made his life miserable. It's a wonder it made it into the film that because am I supposed to tell what happened?
Well, no, I mean, they have to read the book, because what's funny is that that scene, the story that caused you to be so reluctant to do what the director kept asking you to do comes up later on in another story when you're talking about your uncle's place and sneaking in to watch the hula dancers or the dancing girls. And that was, it brings the reason why you could, which I thought was really funny, because we get a tidbit of that story, but we get the full story later on in the book when you do the dance at home and your mom is like horrified and drags you out of the room because you were doing what the dancers were doing in the club. Like you're just, and like all little kids, you know, they see something, will mimic it, and then sometimes it's not appropriate. And like,
well, I was much younger when I did that. And I thought that scene, just for your listeners, I was very young. I was probably 4, just maybe 4. And we were allowed to go and see the 8 o'clock show at my uncle's nightclub if there was something like a magician or a clown or a horse, particularly because I was crazy about horses. And so I could go see the animal shows, if there were a dog show or something like that in that, when we could see it. But of course, part of that was appropriate for children, but then part of the show was also the chorus girls. So we saw that part, even though, you know, my parents probably, and there was this one dance that they did that I tried to imitate, was they were doing a hula dance, and they kind of did this kind of shimmy thing around, you know, around the stage at the end of the dance. And so I tried to imitate that. But because I couldn't see their underwear, I kind of assumed they weren't wearing any. So I didn't wear any. When I was demonstrating my exotic dance for my parents and my Uncle Ace, I thought I would do that, entertain them. And so I'm there with my little hula skirt and no panties. And so I'm dancing around the living room, and my mother's horrified and said, Betty Ann, where are your panties? I said, well, they didn't wear any, you know. And she just hustled me right out of the room and back into my blue corduroy overalls. That was the end of my exotic dancing.
Your short-lived exotic dancing career.
Yeah. So a year or so later, or 6 months later, when in Hurricane, Ford asked me to, you know, I was supposed to not wear any panties under my pareo, which is a little sarong. So, I mean, the story was I was supposed to be adrift in a canoe at sea at the height of the hurricane, and the winds blow my pareo off. And so then I was supposed to crawl into the bow of the boat with my little bare butt showing. And I wasn't about to do that. But I couldn't explain that to the director. I mean, I was 4.5 or 5. I couldn't tell him, I can't do what you're asking me to do, because my mother's going to give me holy you know what if I do that. And so anyway, that didn't turn out very well. I eventually did it. They offered all kinds of money.
Well, I love that there's even a photo of the bribe that you got, and I love that the bribe that they gave you is in the book.
Bribe.
You get to
That's
see
right.
what you got for it, and it was just, I mean, even the story where when you were filming the Wizard of Oz and you were trying to get Judy's autograph, and you kept going every day, you would think Judy would have broken down and given you a photo, but you never got that photograph. And that was like, oh, what a bummer. Like, you know, all the other cast members that you were able to get autographs from while you were
Autograph.
doing it. But I love that the photo of you where you're peeking over Judy Garland's shoulder, and it's like that is like, I mean, to me that's better than an autograph. That you're in here with the picture. You have that. Do you have that picture like big blown up, or you have it in
I do. You want to see it? Maybe we could. Can you put your hands on that? I'm asking my husband if he can. The photograph of the original photograph.
Well, I can show you right here the little where she's peeking over the shoulder. It's in the book.
Craig is running.
Yeah. Well, this way too, because
that was good. The story of that Franklin. That is the only photograph in the entire world of that proves that I was on that set. My mother never took a picture of any of the 3 weeks that I was working there. And so there were no other pictures. I didn't have any picture. And Stephen Cox, who found that picture, he has written probably more than 20 books about Hollywood and movies. And his first book was about the Wizard of Oz. And it was about the Munchkins. And he looked up, he tried to find every Munchkin he could locate in the United States. And he traveled all over the country interviewing us. There was no proof that any of us 12 little girls were on the set. There are no records showing that we were on the payroll. There are records of the midgets because Leo Singer was their agent and he kept good records of those, but there are no studio records. They have been done away with. And I didn't have any pictures proving that I was there. So he interviewed me, and then he interviewed my mother to check my story against what she said, and the two stories were, and then he found some other child Munchkins, and we kind of verified parts. We didn't know each other's names actually, but we knew we had the same stories to tell, of experiences.
Well, it's true, and that's you're making films back when it was very much the studio system and that's why I don't think there would be a lot of records. They just hire people, come in and then go away, and then there's no need because you're not in a guild, you're not in, not getting, all the other stuff that people get nowadays.
Oh yeah.
And I think that to me that the whole adventure of your childhood, being so close to the studios, having family that worked in the business, and then all of a sudden you move away to the country, but for your father's help, and I know we've talked about how the book, you have the editor help you put it in order, but it does flow nice chronologically. But one of the big things that when you read the whole book is the relationship between you and your mom and your ethnic identity. And that was one thing that I still wondered, did you ever, and it's not in the book, but I know that you make peace with your mom and you have better relationship, especially towards the end. But I just wondered, did she ever come clean and explain why she had hidden your Chinese heritage from you? Did she ever talk about that? And
no, and as an adult, and especially after I was working at Channel 2, and I was really interested in, I had a tape recorder and I really wanted to hear her stories, because my mother's history, I think, is a very interesting and compelling story. It's not, I don't think, unusual for island people. When she was born, and I suspect that she was born before her parents married each other, she was given to her maternal grandparents. Now, there might be two reasons for that. One, that her parents were not married. But the other, a very strong Hawaiian tradition, is called hanai. And it's a custom, it's a belief that no home is complete without a child, and that the firstborn of a young couple is given to the grandparents to raise, so they will not have an empty home. So I would love to know which one of those was true. Her parents eventually, did marry each other and had 9 other kids. She didn't know they were her brothers and sisters. She didn't know who her mother was. She thought her mother was her Auntie Rose until she was a teenager. My mother was a gifted singer, a lyric soprano, very talented, very pretty, very pretty young woman. And as a child and a young woman, she was on stage at all family events. She knew the family. It was a big family. And she was also, she traveled across the United States singing when she was a teenager. Um, so she had a lot of talent and she was very much admired. And I asked some of her cousins, my aunties, how she was treated as a young person. And they said, oh, she was treated like a little princess, but she was also put on stage. And I think there are two sides of that role. And I don't know how it affected her. She was never willing to talk about herself and her true feelings. She was wounded, I think, very deeply by her upbringing. And I think she never felt very secure.
Well, it made me wonder too, because your mom was in that time period where it was really, anti-Asian, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I know a lot of other people who lived in those early days of Hollywood too. They talk about how would be hiding their cultural identity. I mean, I think we talked about this when we were just chatting when we were doing our practice about how I have family that didn't want us to learn Spanish, that were, they tried not to pass down that part of a culture because they want you to identify as an American, not as anybody else, but as an American. And
if you're going to be success, if you're going to be a success in this country, you had to be American, not anything, and certainly not anything brown. So if you have brown skin, that's, you can't really get away from that. But if you're Irish or German or Italian, you can blend in and become, and that's what has happened. But the brown skin stays with you. You don't get rid of that. My mother pretended that, I think, most of her life, until she was older, really older, that she was all Hawaiian. That's when we were growing up. That's what she told us. We were Hawaiian and Dutch and Irish from my father, who was a Texan and from Wichita Falls. They met in the islands. He was in the Signal Corps and stationed at Schofield Barracks. And they met and married, and they lived in the islands. And they moved here to California when I was 3.5. But she always said she was Hawaiian. We were Hawaiian. I found out when I was 21 years old that she was Chinese Hawaiian. And I confronted her about that. I got my birth certificate because I had applied for a visa. I was going to Europe after my graduation from college. I confronted her with this document. I said, look, you've always told us you were Hawaiian. And here it says you're Chinese Hawaiian. So she was strong in her denial of that. Even at that point, confronted with this official document, she said, you don't have any Chinese blood. I kept it all. It's just so sad.
Yeah,
it's sad.
Well, that's that their relationship with your mom was woven throughout the whole book, and that was one thing. Even the part when you're younger, when she was asking, "Who do you love more?" And that was like, it's like, how do you do that to your children, to ask them that question and to put you in that spot? And even though you didn't mean it to be mean, you just said it just so she'd stop asking you. But I think, like, you can tell, and even as you wrote it, that made your mom withdraw. It made her withdraw a little bit more. And that was why I kept hoping that maybe that after you got to the end, that she would be a little more open. But I think it's a generational thing, because, like, my great grandfather, I think, is from the same generation as your mom, and it was like you just didn't talk about stuff like that. You didn't pass that stuff down to your family. It sort of just kept secret, and we're not supposed to remember that part of stuff. So
I think it's nationally a sad story that so many ethnic people who they suppressed their native languages, they denied their native cultures and traditions and legends and stories and the strengths of those cultures. I mean, your culture, like you said, your grandfather, he showed that. It's it. And Greg is coming.
He found the photo.
No, he just had that's okay. But I think that's one of the sad things about a generation. It was my generation. I grew up at a time when it was not cool to be ethnic. I think it's very different now. I hope it's different now because
Well, it is and it isn't, because my college experience was almost identical to yours. I went to college and people just started asking, where am I from? Where are you from? And I went from California. And like, well, no, where are you
right.
from? And
Where are you really from?
yeah, where
Yeah.
are you really from? And it's
Yeah.
like, I'm from California. And it was just, it's just one of these things that where I grew up, because my family had been in the same town for so long, no one ever asks you that because they know you're from town. Your parents live here, your grandparents live here. But yeah, the minute we went to college, all of a sudden people started asking me about my ethnic background. And I was just sort of taken aback by like, well, what does it matter? And you had that experience kept happening to you when you were at school, that people kept asking, well, where are you from? What's your ethnic background? And it's just something when you grow up with nobody asking you that, and all of a sudden you're in college and people are asking you this, and then, or to explain why, like you had with your cousins who were calling you mainlanders. Now that you've lived there so long, you're the mainlanders. You're no longer an islander. But I have the same experience with why don't you speak Spanish? You know, I get that same sort of that was how I could identify with that on that part, because it still does happen to a lot of us who live here. And like you said, we can't get away that we're brown. We go somewhere we're brown. We're not like everybody else. So we get questioned about, even though that like people forget that California too is an old place. You know, we were colonized by the Spanish in the 1600s, and there's lots of Native American tribes that are very tiny, but people don't know who they are because they're tiny. They're tiny tribes that are around and still around and still active. I have cousins who are active in the Kumeyaay in the down south, and it's just, yeah, it's strange that people forget that there's big chunks of American history that get forgotten.
I know.
um,
Yeah. I hope it comes back. Although this recent wave of racism and, white supremacy, we could get into that again. So I don't know whether we're going backwards or
well, yeah, it's
forward.
just, and I also, well, like, there's like still lots of stuff to talk about in the family, but we're like halfway through. I don't want to jump too far. So I think one of the hardest parts for me to read in the book, and it's a huge tragedy in your life, is the fire, the Oakland fire, and just the burning of your home and the recovery. And it's like, I still think it's awesome that you were able to be on the news, but that was your career at the time. And I don't know if you want to talk about that part of the book about.
Well, yes, because so many people are losing their homes now, and when to lose it, I mean, it was total loss. The foundation of our house was so destroyed, we couldn't rebuild on that even. I mean, even if we had been able to rebuild. But a friend told us shortly after the fire that there was a silver lining in that somewhere. And I was like, that's just no way. You can't, I mean, all the memories, all the tokens, all the things the kids had made in wood shop and, everything, all the tokens of memories were gone. And my grandmother's jewelry, and I used to lie awake at night and, cry about things I lost that were irreplaceable, wonderful. My Hawaiian grandmother, had a lot of beautiful jewelry. She had danced for Queen Liliuokalani. And so she had, lots of gorgeous bracelets and necklaces. And I was crying over a particular opal that she had my mother had given me that had been my grandmother's. And I was very sad about that. But one day my oldest son, Dan, said he had to go back to his apartment. He and my youngest son were staying with us on our boat. We had a sailboat at the time. That's what we were living on after the fire, because at least it was our little piece of territory. So he said, I'll be back. I'm going to go to my apartment and get something. And he came back that afternoon. He was walking across the parking lot. He has his hand behind his back. And he said, Mom, I hear you crying at night, thinking about all the things you lost. And he said, and I thought, maybe when you do that, if you take a look at this picture, then you won't be so sad, because this is what you didn't lose. And it was a picture of him and his two brothers after a barbecue that summer, and their arms are around each other and they're all grinning into the camera, so happy. And it was just a a jolt back to a reality of the real priorities in life, that I did not lose what was most important to me, that what I had lost was stuff. And some stuff is better than other stuff, but it's all just stuff. Even my grandmother's opal was just stuff. So the fires today, that's what I would say to people who, I mean, there are 5,000 people lost their homes here in the fires around Sonoma a few years ago. And it's awful. And you have to start over again. But there is life, and there are silver linings in those clouds sometimes. And life is what you make of it going forward. You can't, so some things are gone they're gone forever. But it changed our lives, because my husband and I had been planning to go sailing after I retired. We were going to just take off in our sailboat and head across the Pacific. Life would have been very different. We didn't do that. We couldn't do that. That was going to happen. I was 10 months away, or a year away from retiring at that point. So things changed. When we looked up after, we spent about 2 or 3 years buying a house, furnishing the house, getting our feet back, and just recovering emotionally from the fire. Our sailing years were gone. We realized we hadn't been on the boat for 2 years. We sold the boat. We're here in Sonoma. I'm teaching hula. This is the best retirement I can ever even imagine, that what we are doing now. My husband, Craig, photographs. You ask him what he does. He says, I take pictures of hula girls, of hula dancers. And my wife really likes it. He documents, we have 11 volumes of pictures he's taken of hula mai. I mean, it's a wonderful life. We dance, we sing.
Well, it also, the events of after that fire brought the community together. It also brought, because you lost heirlooms, you lost bits of your family past, but then your mother gives you I forgot what it's yeah, and you have that, and I kept thinking that needs to go to a museum, because like, where do you take this up? And like, even when you move to Sonoma, you're like trying to find a house where you can keep it in, and to make sure that you can protect it and preserve that history. But yeah, it's just, but this also, you were a reporter, but before you were a reporter, you were an activist. And I think even after this tragedy, you were still an activist, to helping to get legislation sort of working in a way to help protect insurers who have lost. And you talk about how that is still ongoing, that they're still trying to get that legislation through to help the actual victims of fires and the victims of, tragedies from the big insurers.
The thing that happened, the Oakland fire, the East Bay firestorm, 3,000 homes were lost. And these were homes in the hills of the East Bay. So they're affluent doctors, lawyers, judges, a couple of city council people, and members of the board of supervisors. These are powerful people. So we realized that the insurance regulations protect the insurance companies, and they were written by the insurance lobbyists. So that realization came, and we immediately organized into groups, company by company so all the State Farm people met and exchanged stories. It had never happened before. All the AAA people met and exchanged stories, farmers, everything. And we were trying to get, we saw how the regulations were against the homeowners. We didn't have any rights, really. I mean, it was shocking. And the regulations had never been tested in as massive a way before as they were after that fire. So I got busy, and I was retired. So I worked on homeowners insurance reform, and I had a lot of fun doing it. We went to Sacramento at least once every week for an entire year. I organized a public hearing with people from the survivors from the fire telling their insurance stories. Is one horror story after another. All the nasty games that insurance companies were playing to delay paying the claims, because insurance companies are not in business to pay out money on their claims. They're in business to take care of little stuff. but really to invest all the money they get in, in other things to make more money. So there were a lot of things that happened. We didn't get our bill passed. It passed the legislature,
Mhm.
but by the time it worked its way through the legislature, the assemblymen and the state senators were divided absolutely into two partisan groups. And it all became a partisan issue. We had all the Democrats were in favor of it, of the reform measure. The Republicans were against it. We had a Republican governor, Pete Wilson, at the time. And when one of the insurance lobbyists assured me that our bill would never get signed by the governor. And I said, well, it passed. Everybody's in favor of it. Everybody seems to be. And he says, no. We have the governor. Lesson in hardball politics. And that was true. So
well, it's a story, because when I finished that story, I was just as mad at that story as when you were running for office, and the newspaper sort of like backed the Oakland City Council without help. I was just as mad then too, because it's like you're trying to do good, and then some big corporate entity and a lobbyist, stop it. And it's the most like makes you get really infuriated. And why we should all be out voting, trying to make sure that big business and companies aren't taking away our rights. And that was one thing because this activism, because even when you got into becoming a reporter, it started out with your activism in the League of Women Voters, and that trying to get the news station to that's why I thought I would save this part for the last part, because this is a bigger conversation. Your story about your time working in how you got into reporting, and then one of the things that we talked about has disappeared from the reporting nowadays, that how news media has changed since you were in the business. And because you talk about this, you allude to it, and I think you pointed out in the book as well, that the loss and the deregulation of FCC rules that required news stations to be fair, and that was because that's how you got into the news. You were leading that charge with the League of Women Voters in Oakland to get the news stations to to talk to the community and share what the community was doing. I know you had the one story about the drug dealer, which was sort of scary, but
yes. I don't know how I did that. I couldn't do it today for sure. No, it's a different world today. That's an interesting story. When we rode with the major drug lord for a couple of days, and until he thought I had sicked the cops on him. So he threatened my life. So
yeah, I mean, it's just the kind of, I mean, it's bold, but yeah, you think it's so dangerous when I think any reporter could end up being in that situation where you go somewhere and something could go wrong. I mean, we've seen that in the news, and we've seen it happen before. But yeah, it's just, I still would, what stories do you think about that you could write about that you didn't talk about in the book from your days as a reporter?
Oh my, I mean, there are a million stories. And some stories, I always tried to do stories that would give information that would help people in their lives. And if something was coming up before the council, or there was an issue out there about a neighborhood or an apartment. Oh, there's one story that was interesting. I don't think this was in the book. You tell me if it was in the book. Okay, this huge apartment. Oh, it was the apartment house, the Parkwoods, that actually burned first in the fire several years later. But back in the era when corporations there was conversion to condominiums, where people, owners of big apartment complexes, would convert that whole building into condominiums, so the tenants could no longer rent, or they'd rent at a higher rate. They'd have to buy their place. So there was the Parkwoods apartment was more than 800 units. The the Tenants Association called me and said that a Canadian corporation was about to buy, was, going to go to city council, wanted to buy the Parkwoods apartments and convert it into condominiums, and that none of, it would double the cost of their their rent, or they couldn't afford, the people were going to be, forced to leave, forced to move out. So I looked into it and I found out that this Canadian corporation, this Dayon Corporation, had a front man in Oakland, a Black contractor. So I went to the county records and looked him up, and I found out that he had a really bad record of business. He had broken contracts. He had not fulfilled anything. He had several bad loans. He had it was not a good business record. And so it was obvious that this was just a front man, because the mayor was Black, and you had to have a minority businessman that would advance your chances of getting something passed in the Oakland City Council. And that's all he was just a figurehead. And so I did my story before the issue came up to city council, and the city council hadn't known this about this Canadian corporation. They voted against the conversion. The tenants kept their apartments. Everybody was happy. I was able to do something that was really useful, because it was information that the public needed and the councilmen needed in order to make a better decision than they would have made otherwise. So I felt really good about that. The fact is that getting something in the newspapers or on the air is not going to solve your problem. It's not. It might make you feel good, get a little, your 15 minutes of fame or whatever, but it isn't good. Once in a while, I mean, that was an exception. But a lot of times I just sort of tried all the time to do something like that. Once in a while, you make a score, and sometimes you don't. Most of the time.
You wrote about that too, where you would start to follow a story, but you didn't have enough to make it actually to a television story.
Oh, pictures.
The pictures. They wanted the pictures. You have to have the pictures to go with the story, and it's like that would be so hard because when you became a reporter, that was one of the things you were investigating. You were doing, this trying to investigate and to highlight these things that are going wrong with government. These things are not being done correctly. And then to get to a point where you can't get it so it could go on the television. That must have been so frustrating to drive you mad that you can't do something because you can't get enough pictures to go with it. Like, I think you were talking about, there's a part of the story where you're talking about all the department heads that are missing from a city, but you can't just go around filming empty offices to get it on the news. It's just that has that was just like, that must be, I think a lot of people don't realize that kind of stuff that the reporters are doing, that all the stuff that doesn't make it into the news, because it is the segments that have to flow, the segments that have to make the news flow on TV.
Well, and that's exactly why there isn't a lot of in-depth reporting on local television, because it takes too much time and it's too expensive. So every minute of television, you want pictures, you want action. And so it's easier to go out and do other kinds of stories, a traffic accident, a body recovered somewhere, the weather. I mean, sports, there are all sorts of things that lend themselves to TV. And like Michael McEwen said decades ago, the medium's the message. And so pictures, does this story you want to tell have pictures naturally? And if it does, you've got a chance of getting it on television. If it doesn't, forget it. Unless you can think of some way to go around it,
Yeah, and that was like, when reading that stuff and how you explain it, it's like, wow, that must have been the most frustrating thing to have. You start doing all this research, do all this work, and then it didn't have enough pictures to make it into the newsreel, and then and then you have the hour-long programs too that you wrote about. Some of the what you first started doing was the hour-long program, right? And and then you moved to the newsroom. But I know you wanted to talk about the FCC rule. So you got into the business because the station realized that they could be sued because they weren't following FCC regulations.
Yeah, but no stations were. Yeah, it wasn't just Channel 2. There weren't any stations that were following all of the FCC regulations because there were a lot of them and they were onerous to follow. But in the 60s, which was the decade of supreme activism in a lot of areas, you're probably not old enough to remember the activism of the 60s, but there were, the main thing was the anti-war movement, but it was the women's movement and black light, black is beautiful, that all, I mean, there were just a lot of major movements, just everything happening in the 60s. And one of the smaller movements that didn't, get a lot of airtime was that some activists started suing they sued a couple of stations, radio and television in those days were all on using the public airways to broadcast. They were all broadcast stations. So you had to get a license to use that. And when the FCC regulations were written back in the 30s, it was an age of idealism. And it said, oh, if somebody's going to get a license to use the public airways, you're going to have to serve the public interest. So you can do that in this way, and this way, this way, and this way, this way. You can be fair on all political issues. You do all sides. And every year, this was a thing that stations hated, and nobody did it at the time. Every year, take your executives, your department heads, and have them talk to all the leaders in your viewing or listening audience and find out what they think are their main 20 concerns. What are the top 20 issues in your audience? And then tell us what you've done in your news and community affairs programs to address those 20 issues. Well, nobody did it until a couple of stations got sued, and then stations started doing that. They all hated it. They hated it because it took time out from money-making activity. So it was very unpopular, but they had to do it. All this is little known, and it's still not known very well. What is known is that in 1987, so we're talking 25 years later, Republican legislature and Republican President Ronald Reagan deregulated a lot of businesses. Just get government out of our lives. Boom, 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 boom. And television, or the FCC regulations, were one of the things that went in that deregulation era. So that when it happened, it wasn't broadcast. It wasn't talked about on whatever talk show radios or stations there were in those days. I don't know. Nobody talked about it. The stations didn't want to talk about it. So it wasn't discussed. It didn't get much coverage in the newspapers either. So it happened quietly. But I was crying about it because, and I tell Craig, I'd run around. I mean, he can testify that it got to be sort of a big pain, and I get to be a big pain in his neck. But I'm doing around. See, there's another example. The deregulation is the first nail in the coffin of democracy, and unfortunately, I think that is borne out. Now, there are things today that was before cable television became so popular, and certainly before social media, before all the internet and everything. And there isn't really, that's a different type of regulation that would be facing the government. And we aren't facing that now. We're talking about it though. We are talking about it because we see the danger that, and the damage that misinformation is doing to our democracy. So
the question is, so when did the deregulation happened while you were working, right, Betty? Betty Ann, did it happen while you were still working in your career as a reporter, or did it happen after you retired?
The deregulation?
Yeah.
Oh no, it happened in 1987. That's when the law went into effect. Mm-hmm. The impact of it was very gradual because you had people, I mean, they didn't change all the personnel at the station because, it just, and so you kept on doing things. But I retired in 91, so and there weren't any major signs of things changing at that. Things change very gradually over the culture of a television station. Or any big
too, as people come and go, and as new people come in, and the culture inside the station changes as people get hired and fired, and I think that's what we've seen over the last couple decades of with this deregulation coming, the rise of, you know, like it was, I thought you mentioned in the book, is people don't know the difference between commentary versus news reporting, because it's so blurred now.
It's blurred now. Yeah, and a lot of people are talking about that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's true. But it was very, very strict. If you had on the news, if you did something that had more than one side to it, it was conscientiously followed that you had to have the other side. You had to give equal time or fairness, or, you know, there are at least two sides on every issue. So
Mhm.
hopefully you would have representatives on your air to discuss all that stuff. So other examples of that, there would never be a Rush Limbaugh talk show on the station that would dominate and then have only that side on any station. And we could talk about Fox News. Fox now owns Channel 2. When I was working there, it was the largest independent station in the United States. It was owned by the Cox sisters out of Atlanta, Georgia. But the buck at Channel 2, the buck stopped at the corner office right there in Oakland. You know, they didn't have to answer to corporate political interests or anything like that. Now they do, and it's for people to figure that out.
And I think that was even when you first started, you were doing that. You were doing the having the show with both sides of an issue. That was kind of the programs you were doing. So well, we only have a few more minutes left, and I still want to talk about hula. Hula
Okay.
was because you still teach hula, and you have this really great program in your lending library. Sorry, I'm like getting the frog.
You have a cough drop. I could give you a cough drop. If I could.
But the hula that really, the story of Ida, of your mom, of all the people who, I mean, you started with hula when you were a little kid, but you really learned it and brought it back to your life as an older adult. And I was like, what are the questions to ask about that? Because that is you now, right? You're the hula master.
Well, I don't know that I'm not a hula master,
but you won the treasure artist in Sonoma.
Yes, yes.
And then you still have, and you're still teaching hula, right? You were teaching hula via Zoom.
Tomorrow morning, 10:30, right on my deck. Yeah. No, after I retired from Channel 2, I hadn't danced for 30 years, 35 years. I was too busy when I was reporting, and that was when I was raising my kids too. And so I didn't really have enough time to spend doing a good job of hula. And I either did it wholeheartedly or I didn't do it at all. So I left it alone for 30 years. And then about 5 years after I left Channel 2, after I retired from Channel 2, I decompressed and I thought, oh, and I studied Spanish. That was one of my retirement things. I really wanted to become fluent in Spanish. So I did that first. And after about 5 years, I thought, I'd like to dance hula again, but I didn't have any choreography. I didn't have my notes. I didn't have any costumes. That had all burned up in the fire. I didn't even have phone numbers of the women I used to dance with. And Ida had died. She died in the 90s. And so she was, I didn't have any contact back in the Hawaiian community. So a most wonderful thing happened. Ida's grandson had a baby, married, had a baby, and invited me to the christening of his daughter. And I thought, yes, I'm going to go because he might have invited other people who danced with Ida the same time I did. And it was true. That happened. And I met two women there at the christening party who had danced with her. And they had all the choreography. We started dancing together once a month. They'd come up from Oakland and we would dance all day once a month. And that brought Ida back into my life. And they made copies of all the choreography for me. I now have like 200 or 300 hulas of her choreography that I teach my students now. And that's the basis of Hula Mai. although I also choreograph some hula, but you know, it is such a wonderful thing. So I think I said before, it's the best retirement that could ever be. And that I will never feel the top of that field because I don't speak Hawaiian. My mother was a native speaker, but she never taught me the language. I wish I knew the language because that is also the key to doing, being a master teacher of a kumu hula. Uh, but I do the best I can. And I, the books behind me are that's the Hawaiian Library. Oh, you're the Larkspur Library. This is the Hula Mai Library. These are books that my mother had. They're books that I had throughout my younger days, and they're all here. And I also buy new books for that. But these are books for my students to check out, and on history of the islands and all aspects of the hula, the history of the hula, and all of everything that's island. So it's a very rich and full life, and I love it when somebody in the grocery store says, "Oh, you're the hula lady," right? And it's very wonderful, and to be recognized by the city council. It was the Fine Arts Commission here in Sonoma through the city council that named me treasure artist. That's a Sonoma tradition that goes back 40 years or so, and usually it's a painter or a sculptor or a poet or, but for them to recognize that hula, and they say for bringing hula to Sonoma, and they honor the culture and the tradition and the dance and the beauty of it. And so it's been very meaningful to me, and I'm very honored by that.
Well, and I think too that some people don't know that there was the restrictions on hula for a long time too, that certain dances couldn't be taught to anybody because they were trying to culturally protect it. Right. And then I think that now, and I think a lot of the native cultures are trying to, and I have an uncle who does this, who teaches kumiai, which is the language of the Native Americans in Southern California, that we know that we need to pass this on. You can't just hold it. And you wrote about that in the book of how they lifted those restrictions. And so some of the hulas that could only be danced at certain times and sung at certain times have now been opened up so we can make sure that we're passing that knowledge along to new people. And I think even too, you talk about in the book about some of the stuff that you wish you could have done before, but age has not allowed you to do because it's for a younger body. But I just love that you're doing this, and I love that you wrote about this. And I'm really happy that you shared these stories. I know you wrote them for yourselves, and I'm glad your friends talked you into sharing this with us. But so the last thing to say, if anybody has any questions, if you want to pop them in the chat, there's lots of wonderful thank yous in our chat box. So when you get a chance, Betty can scroll through them. But if you have any questions you'd like to ask, if you can use the Q&A or the chat box, I can relay these to Betty Ann, and she can answer your questions. But so we'll give this a few moments. But again, thank you, Betty Ann, for sharing all this stuff with us. And like I said, it was nice to meet you too, Craig, because I got to read about you in the book as well. So
yeah, he's waving to you from behind the screen. Yeah, no, thank you very much for the invitation. That's wonderful. And I love talking to the libraries. And you know what I love? My favorite thing next to hula is I love talking to book clubs. So if any of the people out there belong to a book club and would like me to come and talk, that is really fun, because so many of the stories resonate with other people, and then we get to talk about, well, like
there are lots of stuff that we didn't even talk about. that this is a book that is filled with, I mean, I still love the organ when you got in trouble for playing the organ, the song that you didn't realize that was, and it's funny, I had to look the song up to figure out what it was. It's like, oh my goodness, it's like that would have been so funny to hear in church, but the pastor didn't like that. You had to couldn't play that one. It was so, I was laughing so hard, but it was like, yeah, that would have been me like playing something, because it sounds great, and you were young, and yeah, you didn't know any better. And I just thought that was the funniest thing, that but to be playing this or because I also think too, because you were like 12 years old, right, when you started playing the
Yeah.
organ at church, and all those pedals, all those things to pull, it's and being 12 and sitting there doing it and then playing songs that, yeah, I thought was one of the funniest stories of it. But there are so many great stories in this book, and thank you again for sharing this, the heartbreak and the happiness and the joy, and yeah, nobody's asking questions. So, but thank you again, Betty Ann, for joining us.
Thank you.
And then I'll send a follow up, and then I'll also pass along your. I think you have a website. I found your website, but we'll make sure that people can contact you if they would like you to come join them at a book club. And then when we can be here in person again, I do hope that you'll come down and visit us in person, and people can come by and get your autograph for your
I'd love to.
book.
I'd
So,
love to. Yeah. I love to meet you because I like your aloha shirt.
Yeah, no, I love my Hawaiian shirts. So I thank you for joining us, Betty Ann, and yeah, everybody go out and read the Munchkin Diaries, my personal journey, and Yellow Brick Road. So, but thank you, Betty Ann, for joining us, and you have a great afternoon. So,
thank you so much, Franklin. Thank you very much.
bye.
Bye bye.